So I will just finish for 15 minutes on the following of my previous talk for Charlotte Perrin that was asking so many questions that I prefer to show the slides. And also for you to have a global idea of what are the directions that we can follow to take into account the static flowing transition, the yield stress condition in granular flows. So remember, we were looking at collapse of granular column as a function of time. And with this, now we remove the shallow water or depth average equation. So we have vertical profiles of the horizontal velocity. And for example, here at this time, here you can see that here you have almost a static part, so velocity is almost zero. Then it increases towards the surface. And at the front, you have a particular behavior, because at the front you have sliding, really. You don't have zero velocity at the base. You have sliding and increase of velocity also. So you have a complex behavior with velocity profile that change as a function of time. Okay, so all I showed you before, I showed you that we try to compare simulation with laboratory experiments to really get quantitative agreement and discriminate which model is the best one. And one term that I didn't talk about before is related to the wall friction. It was this picture here. So if you have a granular flow in between two walls, the walls here exert a friction also on the flow, and it is filled also by the grains that are inside the flow. And this is a very well-known process. And if you want to compare quantitatively with laboratory experiments, you have to take it into account. And I don't have time to explain, but as W, which is the distance between the walls, increase, obviously this term goes to zero. And if you have closed walls, then you feel a lot the boundaries. And so this friction term here, this friction force, also obey a Coulomb type friction law, where mu W is the friction between the grains and the wall, and P is the pressure, normal stress. So if you add these terms here that also follow a yield stress condition, meaning that if the wall is, you have high friction on the wall, then the material stop also. So you have to be above a certain threshold to make the material flowing. So now I will show you what is the effect, is it small or not, if we compare quantitatively with laboratory experiments. So this is a laboratory experiment with small dots here as a function of time until the deposit, and we test different models. So when W is infinity, it means that I don't take into account the friction wall of the wall. And here the slope angle is 10 degrees. So you can see that when I don't take into account the wall, it's in red. I have not so much different with the simulation where I take into account the walls in blue here. But as time changes, I start to have differences. And here, for example, you see that by taking into account the wall effect, it makes it possible for the column to go down slowly. And also very interesting, but something which is also intuitive, is that it changes the position of the static flowing interface. So for example, in blue, above you have flowing material, and under it you have static material. And if you take into account the wall effect, it increases the friction, and so it decreases the thickness of the layer where the material is flowing. So at the end, if you look at the deposit, you have a small difference between when you take into account wall friction in blue and when you don't take into account. And in this case, we have a really good, very good agreement with the deposits observed in the laboratory experiments without fitting the parameters. And this is, the effect is much stronger when you increase the slope angle, because then you have higher velocity. And here I just represented the deposit the deposit is here at 22 degrees. And you can see that if you don't take into account the wall effect, you go much too far. This is the red line here compared to the experiment here. But if you take the wall effect, then you really well reproduce the deposits. And also you see that in the case when you didn't take into account the wall effect, you still have a static flowing interface, meaning that you still have granular material that is continue flowing, while in the blue case, everything almost stops about at the same time of the experiments. So if you want to compare really simulation with laboratory experiments, you see you have to take a lot of things into account, the gate, the wall effect, and so on. So I already spoke about that. So now if we come back to the former objective that we had, is to apply these models to a real landslide, we will not solve the full Navier-Stokes free surface equation with Drucker-Prager law at the scale of the field. So we have to simplify the equation. And as I told you before, in shallow water model, where we consider a flowing layer above a static layer, all the problem is what do we have to put as an equation for the static flowing interface. And until now, a lot of people gave some empirical functions. And what was the work of Christelle Lusseau in her PhD was to start with the Drucker-Prager full Navier-Stokes equation and find analytical solution in simple cases. And in this case, it's a uniform flow. So you have a uniform flowing layer above a uniform static layer. And you look at a given position in space as a function of time. And then this static flow interface will change. It will go down and go up until the material stops, for example. And the analytical solution of full Navier-Stokes equation gives these two equations for the variation in time of the static flowing interface here. And you see that if you consider that the viscosity here, what I called eta before is nu now, is 0, then you get this function, for example, here. And you see that the static flowing interface varies as an inverse of the gradient of the velocity exactly at this position. So if you want to describe static flowing interface, you have to have the value of the gradient of u at the static flowing interface. And so you see that if you have shallow equation with depth RH model, you don't have any velocity gradient and you will not be able to describe this static flowing interface. And so the other terms are, here theta is the slope angle, delta is the friction coefficient, and this depends also on the gradient of h, which is 0 here, but which could be different of 0. And now if you take into account the viscosity, which is the case actually, then it's much more complex and you have something that depends on the third derivative of the velocity field. So from this, we decided not to try to find any relation to close the shallow water equation, and we decided to use a method that will describe the velocity profile in a way that is much simpler than solving the full Navier-Stokes equation. And one possibility, I don't say that it's the best one, but it has to be tested, is to use hydrostatic, what I call multi-layer model. And in this framework, what you do, you have a description of variation of velocity in depth, but you simplify your equation by assuming hydrostatic pressure. So you still have less heavy models, but you have what you want is a velocity profile, and you hope that the velocity profile calculated in this case is not too far to the true velocity profile. So here when you do that, you assume hydrostatic pressure, and you assume that the full layer can be divided into several layers. And this is something that you know maybe better than me, that is developing in mathematics, in particular by the team of Odius and Jacques Sainte-Marie and also Fernandez Nieto, etc. So when you use a shallow multi-layer, what I call shallow model, hydrostatic model, you get these equations here. So you have mass conservation and momentum conservation. And now you see you have some terms with the gradient of Z, the gradient of U in the vertical or perpendicular to the slope direction. This is the term related to friction. And what is interesting is that depending on the width between the two walls, remember the width that exerts some friction on the flow, if you change its width, you will change completely the velocity profile. And if you decrease the width, you will have exponentially a decrease in function. And if you increase the space between the walls, you will have some kind of Bagnall type velocity profile. And this is something that we measure in the laboratory. We measure these different profiles depending on the spacing between the walls. So if you try to see what is the influence of taking into account this multi-layer approach compared to monolayer approach, so if you take a constant friction angle in the flow law here, you have almost no difference actually when you simulate granular collapse. So the laboratory experiments are in blue as a function of time until the deposit. And the simulation with monolayer, which is shallow water equation, is in dashed line, and multi-layer is this one. But you start to see difference when you use the mu of I rheology. Remember, it is when the friction coefficient is not constant but depends on the inertial number. Then you can see, for example, if you look at the deposit, that you well reproduce the deposit with the multi-layer model and not with the monolayer model. So this is something that has to be looked deeper. And if you add now wall friction, then, for example, if you look at the deposit at 22 degrees, you have wall friction here and the multi-layer mu of I rheology in red, and you quite well reproduce the deposit observed experimentally. So what I want to say here is that one direction to take into account erosion deposition process is to use multi-layer approach and not to prescribe some empirical law for the static flowing transition, what we call erosion laws, because it comes naturally out of this kind of models. And something, I just wanted to show you when you look into details. So for example, if you have this configuration here, we have some experiments, and we look at how this static flowing interface change. And for example, at the beginning, you have increase of the flowing layer, so B decrease, and then it goes down to zero when everything stops. And it is what I show you here to finish with this part. So this is time, and here you are. Here is the erosion layer, so static layer, and here's the flowing layer. At the beginning, you see that the flowing part is going deeper in the erodible layer, and then it goes back to zero as a function of time. This is the experiments here, and with the mu of I. With the mu of I rheology, we are able to simulate the fact that you have penetration of the flowing layer into the erodible layer and go up to zero. So this is just to show that this kind of model have the possibility to describe static flowing interface without adding anything more in your model, just taking your equations. Okay. The conclusion of this part is that, as you see, there is still a lot of things to do to improve the models at the continuum scale, as the one I showed you before, but also for discrete element model that we could use for interpretation of high-frequency data. So it was 15 minutes to finish this part, and now I will I will go to the last part of last talk, which is related to a completely different environment. But the method is very similar to what I show you for landslide. And here we go to Greenland. We go from landslide to Greenland here, and we will study the seismic waves generated by a different motion, which is when an iceberg is calving, it rotates against the glacier terminus, generates seismic waves that can be recorded again at hundreds of kilometers from the source. And what we want to do is to use this signal to recover the volume of the icebergs and to follow the ice mass loss in Greenland just using seismic data. So again, I show you the same picture. So we were looking at this kind of signal for landslide, and now we are looking at this kind of signal that you can record during these events. And you see that the signal is complex here. And if you look in details, you have different events, and I will describe them now. So first, I will describe why we do this kind of studies. Then I will show you how we invert the signal to find the force generated by the iceberg. Then how we recover the iceberg volume by comparing inversion and simulation, and how we can monitor the ice mass loss due to calving. And also I will go a little bit into more details into the numerical modeling of iceberg calving, because there is a key problem of fluid structure interaction in this kind of process that is still open. So the main idea here is to quantify if there is an increase of ice mass loss linked to climatic change. We know that there is, but we don't know really is there an increase of calving of iceberg or increase of melting due to higher elevation of the ocean temperature and so on. So we want to quantify this ice mass loss and also predict the stability of glacier, because if you start to have a lot of icebergs, then you may destabilize the glacier. And so the first studies have been made in 2003, where people were wondering about very strange signals. And when they tried to locate these seismic signals, they observed that they were located on the coast of Greenland. And they tried to see what causes these very big earthquakes. And since this first work, there have been a lot of studies of seismic signals generated by glacier. And there are a lot of things that generate seismicity. For example, crevassing, fractures in the ice generate high-frequency signal. Iceberg calving, you will see, generate very big signal. Also, the friction between the glacier and the bedrock can generate also seismic signal, and etc. And so we will focus here on several iceberg calving, and I show you one example of the Baudouin Glacier, which is completely at the northwest of Greenland, when I will go tomorrow, actually, to put some seismic station, and you will see that the western glacier are starting to lose more and more mass compared to the eastern glacier of Greenland. And this is something that we observe thanks to the seismic signal. So if we look at a typical glacier here, so the ice terminating glacier, they melt from increasing value of the temperature, but they also melt, they also lose mass by these big icebergs, and these icebergs can reach 1 kilometer size. It is really huge. And the question is how much mass is lost by calving and how much mass is lost by melting of ocean, by increase of ocean temperature. And one thing that has been observed is that when the glacier loses a very big iceberg, so 1 kilometer size, this can destabilize the glacier that start to move faster and may even be completely destabilized. And this is one problem that could happen when we have increase of climate change. Another very important problem is for oceanographers, and is that this big iceberg, it took a lot of time for this iceberg to melt, and the melting of this iceberg releases fresh water into the ocean, which is colder and also have a smaller salinity, and this can change the local currents. And in particular, this is something that oceanographers say that they don't really know how to quantify this. So this is one point. And also people in global climate change, they also have simplified models for ice sheets, and they don't know what to put as calving laws, how much icebergs are lost. And this is something that we expect to be able to quantify thanks to our seismic analysis. And another point, which is important for some people, this is from these narwhals, is that it has been shown recently that they prefer to go in glacier with less iceberg calving. And people think is that because when you have this big iceberg calving, the nutrients that are in the water are perturbed, and they prefer to go in places where you don't have this. So this iceberg have an influence at the local to global scale. So here we will not describe everything, obviously, and we will focus on how this iceberg rotates, because when the iceberg rotates, it exerts a contact force on the glacier, and the fluctuation of this contact force generates seismic waves in the ice and in the bedrock that you can record at hundreds of kilometers. And I will show you that. For example, you will see here, you have to look both at this, because here you will see a big iceberg that will calve, and here another smaller one. And here you will see the seismic signal that we record at different stations, so 5 kilometers, but up to 660 kilometers. So I hope it will work. Yes. So first look at here. It will rotate like this. You see some ice avalanche, and here you will see this iceberg that calves, and here another one that calves on the other side. So you have what we call bottom out. So this one, I don't know if you had time to see, it goes like this. And the other one, which is smaller, it goes like this. So bottom out or top out. Can you do it again? Sorry? Yeah, okay. So, ice avalanche. Okay, so it is quite impressive. And what is also interesting, I don't know if you look at this, but here this is the signal for the first iceberg, and this one is the signal for the second iceberg. Yes? What is the space of the... This is 1 kilometer. It's very, very big masses. And so if you look, it seems that the amplitude of the signal is the same for the two icebergs, but you see that there is a small one and a very big one. So it is why up to now people were not able to recover the volume of the iceberg by looking at the amplitude of the signal. It's not simply related, and I will show you, thanks to numerical modeling, that in fact it is not related, and this kind of iceberg, which are top out, that generate higher amplitude than the ones that are bottom out, due to the interaction with water. So, at the first time, so in the first period, when the people looked at this, now you are very well aware of what we can do with seismic data. If we have low-frequency seismic data, we can invert them and recover the force that generates these waves. And it is what people did. But at that time, they didn't really know that we can do that without constraint. And they assumed this kind of force, so some acceleration, deceleration, as for landslide. And when they invert the seismic signal with this shape, they found a direction that was perpendicular to the coast, to the glacier. And the first interpretation was that this signal were due to acceleration and deceleration of the glacier. But after, with video, they saw that actually it was related to iceberg calving. And I will show you why they were thinking first that the force was like this. So without knowing how to recover the volume, they were able to count the events, and they were able to see that from 1995 to now, the number of events increased a lot. And now the question is that, do the volume increase? Because sometimes you have more smaller events, and then it's okay. But okay, so we will be able to recover the iceberg volume by doing the same kind of methodology than for landslide, by inverting the full force history, so not just that, but having the full waveform, and coupling with mechanical modeling of the force, and trying to find the best model, and through that, we were able to find the good volume. And it is what I will show you. Okay? So we do the same thing as for landslide. So we have what we measure on our seismometer. It has a complex waveform. We deconvolute with the Green's functions, which is the Earth's response of the Earth, and we are able to find the force that generates our seismic data here. And this force has this shape, for example. And you have to keep something in mind is that with seismic data, we cannot recover the full force. We have the force in a frequency band, which is the frequency band of the instruments. It's not completely broad. You always have something that is filtered, actually. So the frequency band is between 0.01 to 0.1 Hertz, so 10 to 100 seconds. And so this is the force that you measure, that you can recover at your stations. And in black, this is the force that we recovered using our inversion, which is much more complex than the force that people inverted before with this acceleration-deceleration force, which is in red here. So we see a very complex waveform, not just this kind of simple things. And if we look at different frequency bands, this is high frequency for glacier, we don't see one event, but we see several events. So, and if we look with the movie, this is the first bottom-out big iceberg's rotation, and this is the smallest top-out iceberg. And if we look at even lower frequencies, this is the motion of ice melange due to the perturbation due to iceberg. And I will not speak about that here. But. So the question is, can we simulate the force by simulating the process of iceberg calving? And it is what we try to do. So we use a finite element model here, where we have an iceberg, we have a glacier wall, and we simulate the rotation of the iceberg in a fluid, but because we don't have a fluid structure models that are ready to do that, we will simplify the effect of water, and this is the key point, the key problem of these things, but still we can have something. And so typical dimension of the iceberg are 600 meter height to 1 kilometer high. So the width, the aspect ratio, which is the width divided by the height, is between 0.1 and 0.75. Because if you have a square iceberg, they will not rotate. You can test it at home. For something to rotate, it has to be thin enough, because it is stable if it is very wide. So this is typically. And one thing that is important that we didn't know before is the position of the iceberg compared to the neutrally buoyant iceberg equilibrium. Because the glacier, when they go into the water, they are not at the equilibrium of an iceberg alone, so they can be higher or down. And depending on that, you will have an oscillation of your iceberg when it rotates that will affect the signal, and we can see that on the field. So we did a 2D computation and assume a given length in this direction. So the equations that we solve are the classical equations. So you have mass conservation, conservation of momentum, and here we take a rheology which is elastic. So we have a gravity. And again, the problem is to say something about the fluid structure interaction. And we consider the hydrostatic water pressure. So we consider that when the iceberg rotates, there is a hydrostatic pressure distribution. And the drag force, we consider it as proportional to the velocity to the square at the local position. This is something that is done in fluid structure interaction, and at the end of my talk, I will really go into the details of that. So I will show you some simulation of what happens when the iceberg rotates, and the colors that you will see here are related to the stresses inside the ice. So, and here you have the force that is generated here. So you see that it increases and decreases when the iceberg loses contact with the wall. So we see here that the force is not at all acceleration, deceleration things. It's just increase and decrease when you lose contact, which is natural, intuitive. Okay? And what we did thousands of simulations and vary the thickness, the aspect ratio, and the position, delta z, to generate kind of a catalog of simulated forces that we will compare to the inverted force to find the best model, and then have a way to go back to the volume, to the best volume. So, if we look at different time, this is the same simulation here, and this is the force that you showed before. And what you see is that if we filter this force in the frequency band of seismometers, you recover this positive-negative shape. And it is not at all related to the physical process, it's related to filtering. If you have something that increase and decrease, and you filter in this frequency band, you get this signal. So it's why people were thinking initially that it was something that was positive and negative. So it's just filtering effect. So here is the frequency band of the simulation that we observe. And now that we have this model, we can see how the force vary depending on the thickness, aspect ratio, and delta z. So for example, if you have a very thin iceberg here, epsilon equals 0.1, you have this kind of force, the force as a function of time. So if the iceberg is 600 meters high, you have this increase and decrease. This is the filtered force here. And if you increase the thickness, obviously you get higher force here. But you see that if you take higher aspect ratio, for the same h, you have a different force. And what is interesting is that the shape of the force is different. For example, if you look at the gray line here and here it goes slowly to 0, while here it goes quite fast to 0. And this changes the filtered force, because if you have a rapid change, you will have a filtered force that is going really down. So the signature of the aspect ratio is in the slope of the force, not in the amplitude of the force. So if you represent here the maximum force for a lot of thickness and a lot of aspect ratio, so you can see the amplitude of the force in color here, you can see that you have high amplitude here and lower amplitude for these values. And if we represent lines of equal volume here, you see for a given volume you can have very different forces. And it is what you saw on the movie. So you have a small volume that has the same force, maximum force, as a big one. It depends on everything, actually. So it's impossible to recover the volume from the maximum force. We need the full force history. So the full shape will encode the different parameters, as for landslide, actually. And I show you something that before people were thinking that bottom-out iceberg gave the same force as top-out because of the model that they use. But with our model, so if we have bottom-out, it was the big one, the first one that we see. It is, you have this force. And if you don't take into account the drag, which is the interaction of water with the iceberg, you get this dashed line here. And here I represent the filtered force again. So now if you look at the top-out iceberg here, then you get this black line for the same dimension here, but if you don't consider drag, you get exactly the same force. So what makes the difference between the force bottom-out and the force top-out is just the drag force exerted by the water on the iceberg. And I will show you, you will see it's very complicated actually, but so you have to take drag into account, and this was something missing in the previous model. So the last thing that is important is the position of the iceberg compared to the equilibrium. So, for example, if the iceberg is higher than the equilibrium, what you see is this black line here, for example, compared to when the iceberg is neutrally buoyant. Since now you only saw this kind of shape in blue, it increased and decreased the force. But now if the iceberg is not at the equilibrium, you see some high frequency signal, oscillation of the force. And if you filter this, you have the blue line for the equilibrium state and the black line for the non-equilibrium state. And if you look at the associated spectrogram of the simulation here, you see a hole in the spectrogram here, related to this kind of shape. And what is interesting is that we looked at all the spectrogram from seismic data, and we exactly see that. We can see in the seismic spectrogram that for some iceberg we have a hole, and it corresponds to icebergs that are above actually the neutral, where the glacier is above the neutral equilibrium of icebergs. So we can have a signature of this delta Z on our data. So this is also visible on the spectral amplitude. So now that we understand all this, we will do the exercise of comparing all our simulation with the inverted force and try to find the volume for the events that I show you, where we know the volume thanks to the movie, for example. It is what we did here. So this is a very big iceberg. Here the dimension, the length is 2.5 kilometers. Thickness is 800 meters, and aspect ratio is 0.23. So you have a volume of 0.37 cubic kilometers for this iceberg. And it was recorded at the Helheim Glacier here in the southeast of Greenland. And we have very good data for this iceberg. So if we look at the force that we invert from a seismic signal, is in green here. You see this typical shape. And we compare with all our catalog of forces, and the best model, which gives the better variance reduction, is the red model here that reproduces very well the inverted force in the frequency domain of seismic data. And this actually corresponds to this point here, which gives a value of h of more than 850 meters and a value of epsilon of about 0.2. So we have these values from the inversion of the model, which are quite good if we compare with the real values. So we have errors, but still reasonable order of magnitude of the volume thanks to this method. And so now that we have this, we can invert the 20 years of data that we have on this iceberg calving. And it is what we did. So we have about between 200 and 400 events, because here, and this is the limitation of our method, we just use earthquakes that are recorded at the regional scale. because they have to be big to be recorded, not only locally. And it's why we are going to Greenland to try to put some local seismometer and find the distribution of size of icebergs, not only the big one. So when we have this number of events, and we have about 50% of the glacial earthquake seismicity at each glacier that we can analyze. So here you have the number of events as a function of the year, so starting from 1993 to 2014. And this is all the glacial earthquake in blue. And here, this is the glaciers that we were able, the icebergs that we were able to invert. And so we have an increase of number, obviously. This is in the glacier Helheim. But if we do that all over Greenland, we see an increase of number, which was also already observed by other teams. So we have the number that increases. And now we try to see the volume, thanks to our method. And what you see here is the volume here per year, the discharge per year as a function of time. And you see a strong increase of the volume, of the cumulative volume of ice mass loss all over Greenland. And interestingly, we see a difference between the behavior of West Greenland and East Greenland. So this is a cumulative value. So if you have a straight line, it means that the value is constant because it's a cumulative. And if you have an exponential increase, it means that the value increase. You can see that behind. You have almost constant value, and here constant value, increasing value. So what we see is that in Eastern Greenland, there is a constant value of discharge and sometimes a decrease. And in West Greenland, we have a strong increase of ice mass loss. And when we look at what happened on the field, we see that the very big glaciers that were pushing some big iceberg in the ocean, they just retired. And so they don't continue to give big icebergs, while the other one start to give some icebergs. So this has to be more investigated. But we see a clear correlation between this behavior and the position and dynamics of the glaciers. So I try to explain this, which is sometimes a little bit difficult to understand. So here you have Greenland here in this period up to a recent period. And so the size of the cycle represents the amount of volume that is related to iceberg calving. And so in this period, you see that you have very big, a large amount of iceberg that is released in this area. It is Helheim Glacier here. And the color here represents the anomaly of the volume. It means that of the individual volume. So if you have a mean volume over the whole period at a given location, if you have red color, it means that you have individually bigger volume. And if you have blue color, it means that in this period, each iceberg has a smaller size than the average. So you can see that in this period, you have essentially very big volume and very big quantities in this part of Greenland. It decreases. And here you had almost nothing here. The Baudouin Glacier that I show you is here. And here from for the 2000 period, you start to have discharge here that increases and that gives now a very big discharge. While here, in this part where you had very big discharge here, you have smaller discharge and also smaller individual volume. And this could help to give calving laws at the Greenland scale to put as boundary condition is in more global model and to see the response of the ice sheet to this different in spatiotemporal distribution of icebergs. So to finish this, I want to show you that when you see that, you say, okay, we are able to recover the volume, etc. But still, there is some limitation in the models that we use, obviously. And I will show you a very hard time that we had to try to validate what I call the iceberg fluid interaction or fluid structure interaction that we put in our model. And to do that, we compared our simple model, because you saw it is a solid model, and the water is very simply described, with a model that is maybe more closer to reality, even though I know from my colleagues in mathematics that they say that this is not solved, but still there are some models that solve the Navier-Stokes equation with free surface, with all the limitations that this model has. But we compare our simple model to this kind of model, and in particular to the model that is developed in École Centrale at Nantes by people working on boats, interaction of fluid structure for boats. And you will see the very big difference. So if I go to our simple model, I call it SAFIM, but so here you had the iceberg, remember, and it has a contact force with the glacier. And so the force are gravity, buoyancy, and the contact force here. And the fluid structure model is described as follows. So you have the drag force, and it is really something that is an open question for complex structure. So we have the iceberg here, and part of the iceberg is underwater and experience a friction from water around its border. And what is classically done is to assume that this friction force depends on the normal velocities to the square. And we integrate the drag force all over the glacier to have the force that is exerted on the iceberg. And this is a drag coefficient alpha that people change sometimes in this kind of model. And another very important effect is called the added mass effect. And it's related to the fact that when you move a solid into a fluid, you accelerate the fluid around it. And it works as if you add mass to your solid. And it is something that is very tricky. And normally added mass effects are a tensor, not just a coefficient, but we try to stay simple, because if we are not simple enough, it's better to use the full model, and we want to do a lot of simulation. It's always our very complex position between simplicity and reality. And so we assume, for example, that the added mass in the x direction is has this form, z direction and inertial effect. And we took this value from analytical solution of stability of rectangles in water. And so you will see what happened. Okay, so we compare the two models. Yes, and something that is important is, I just told you before the conclusion that it doesn't work very well, actually. But what we wanted to work is the force that the iceberg applied to the glacier, because it is what we invert. And we want to find the parameters of this simple model to be able to reproduce the force. We don't care of the timing of the force, we want to have the shape of the force. Okay, so now let us look at the full Navier-Stokes free surface model. It is called ISIS here. So you have the iceberg that is tilted at the beginning, and you will see so the velocity is represented by these different colors, and there is arrows here that you don't see, but you see the water that is starting moving around the iceberg. So here you see some vortex behind. Up, you see very complex fluid motion here. And just to say, we remove the glacier here, because in this kind of code they cannot simulate solid contacts. It's why we did that. So here you see what happened, and you see an effect of drifting of the iceberg, which is due to the complex force exerted by the fluid. Okay, so to be sure that this model is not completely invalid, I would say, we can compare with laboratory experiments. And I show you some experiments, but there are also experiments without a wall here. So you see iceberg that is rotating. You see the force that increase and then decrease, go to zero, and then you see this bump which is related to the second impact. But just to show you that there is some kind of experiment where we can test the model. And it is what we did for iceberg that is freely rotating in fluid. You can see the inclination of the iceberg as a function of time. And these experiments are in brown here. And this is the simulation with the full Navier-Stokes equation, is this. And you see that we recover well the inclination of the iceberg. And we can compare the position of the iceberg, which is less good, etc. But at the first order, I would say that we reproduce the experiments. So we consider this model as a reference model. And now a big issue is that we want to describe fluid effect in our simple model, and everything I show you, there was no shear force. And normally, if you move a solid into a fluid, you have also a force not on the normal direction only, but also tangential to the motion of the fluid. And this force here actually is very small, as I will show here. So maybe I don't have to enter into the details, but so now I show you what we obtain with our simple model. The same kind of simulation. So you have the iceberg that rotates as a function of time, and you see the very simple force acting on the model because they depend on the square of the velocity of this simple model. But what is important is that we see a drift also of the iceberg in this direction. So some essential features are here, and some are missing, and it is what we want to quantify. And to do that, we represented the horizontal force, the contact force, as a function of time. For the full model, is this in red here. So I'm sorry because I push the force on this direction. So before you had increase and decrease, but this is this actually. So this is negative, and it was positive before. So you have, I would say, increase of the force, and then it goes back to zero. And after, you have some rebounds that are complex and that we don't care about because we will just care about when the iceberg goes up to the horizontal direction. So this is the force with the complete model, and here in gray, you have the force with our model. So it has the same shape, but you see a shift in time between the two models. And if you are familiar with fluid structure interaction, this is related mostly to the added mass effect. And here we did not take added mass, no added mass here. And if we take into account added mass, this is the simulation here, we recover the time evolution of the force, and we have a discrepancy of the amplitude of the force. So what happens if we just take the force with no added mass? Why? Because if we take added mass, we have 3 other parameters to fit, and we don't want to have so many parameters. So we just take this and shift it in time because we don't care about time, because after we will correlate 2 signals without timing. And then if we put the force here in black, we have a very good simulation of the force of the complete model. So this is some kitchen recipes, but it is what we do. And now we want to quantify the errors that we make, and the part of the force that we are interested in is this part. It is what we will invert from seismic data. And so we compare the two models by calculating the difference. And we see that, for example, for different icebergs, so you have thin icebergs with aspect ratio 0.25 or bigger iceberg here, we see that we have error that goes from 4% to 20% in reproducing the force. So it is quite big errors, but it is the error that we got just from the model of drag. And we can improve this by putting drag coefficients that depends on the aspect ratio. And this is something that people do also in the literature. So everything to say that even though we get some volume, this is not very precise volume. We make some errors, and we have to quantify better the errors. And the thing is that fluid structure effects are hard to simplify, actually. But on the other hand, taking into account the full Navier-Stokes equation to do a lot of simulations is also difficult. So there is a position to keep and find the best way of inverting this volume. And actually, this kind of method, if we improve them, makes it possible to get first estimation of spatiotemporal distribution of iceberg calving over a long period of time, because the fact is that we have a recording of this since 20 to 30 years. And as I told this morning, the seismologists or geophysicists, we keep everything because we know that maybe sometimes we will be able to interpret them. So we have a huge quantity of seismic data that we can interpret better now, thanks to this modeling effort. Okay, so it was what I wanted to say, and if you have some questions, would be nice. Okay. Yes?
Yes, I was just wondering, maybe I missed something, but so you have like the glacier has it's very long along the y-axis, and so how do you integrate the force in this axis? So you have 1 point force, but yeah, the contact is all along the glacier. Yeah. So do you just sum up like point force or?
No, actually what we do is we want to go up to 3D simulation, but now what we do, we invert for different value of the length, and for a given length it starts to be stable, and then we have so the thickness change, but the total volume is stable. So this is a very good question, because we observe that for a given range of length in the y direction, we have a stable volume, and it is the volume that we take. So this has to be done in 3D to be really correct.
Since the iceberg is very big, do you think it would be possible to have to get its volume from measurement of the waves it generates when it?
Yeah, it's what we want to do. Yeah, I think it's one way to constrain the volume is not only using seismic wave, but the water waves that are generated due to calving. The problem is that if you look at on the site, you have an ice melange that you have a lot of small ice that is breaking, and so it makes like a viscous layer on top of the ocean that will change the waveform, but maybe we can simulate it. And this is a general idea that we have, not to use only seismic data, but also to use all the waves that are generated. Could be acoustic wave, could be tsunami waves, or to kind of constrain more the process.
Other questions?
That's quite an impressive reconstruction and important too for the knowledge you're after. Let me play the devil's advocate. So you showed in the beginning that from the early approaches to a reconstruction you could not estimate the volume. Mm-hmm. And then you went to take more degrees of freedom of the full dynamics into account, and you got basically a means of nailing the volume more closely. Is it possible that there is another dimension of degrees of freedom for an iceberg, like its geometry or things like that, which could again basically put you off the track and say, this really was at some point we made too constrained an assumption and now we have to redo the thing?
Everything is possible. The thing is that, for example, the first try to get volume from maximum amplitude, clearly it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And we understand why.
Yes.
Now, with the degree of freedom that we give, and the 3D will be very important, but with this degree of freedom, we see for several examples for which we have volume, that we recover the volume. Mm-hmm. So this is the second argument. And the last one is what can change? And it was something that we tested. For example, we test the value of friction of the iceberg against the wall, and it is very small because of the presence of water, and it doesn't change a lot of the force. And the last thing that could be important is the shape of the iceberg, mm-hmm. which is not rectangular, mm-hmm. and is something that we can test also with numerical models. Yeah. And also now there are some data on this kind of shapes, and sometimes you have not really rectangular shape, but they are not so far from rectangular shape. We have to test the effect of that.
And you already did some tests of this?
Yeah, we did, but I could not conclude. It's preliminary. Oh, yeah. And so it is always the idea. We are sure that it's not perfect. Yeah. And what we want to do is to quantify the error. Mm-hmm. And if it's 1 order of magnitude, then no. But we don't believe now, because we test a lot of things, that it will be 1 order of magnitude. Maybe 50%, yes. Factor 2.
A last question? No? Okay. Thanks again. And thank you for your course.